Simon Anholt, welcome to the World Scale Ideas video podcast. You're our second guest in the series. We're very excited to have you here. And I think that what you've been doing with your life, in your career, and what you've got in mind for the future is exactly what our audience would like to learn about and think about. So, on that note, you wrote a book recently. And
Did, yeah.
yeah, can you tell us about that book?
Thank you. That was a nice question to start with. The book is called The Good Country Equation, subtitle, How We Can Repair the World in One Generation. The Good Country Equation is sort of the summary of everything I think I've worked out about the world so far, which is not a lot. I don't know about you, Jim, but the older I get, the fewer opinions I seem to have. Um, I'm in awe of people who have opinions, and everybody these days seems to have so many, and they're so firm on almost every topic. I seem to be moving in the other direction. Somebody told me the other day that this is a symptom of wisdom, which I found very, very reassuring.
Well,
That as you
that's
go,
good to know because then I'm getting much wiser because my opinions are becoming less firm.
yeah,
Uh, the more I am exposed to more information and more experience, which should
absolutely.
be doesn't make sense, but
No, it makes perfect sense.
yeah,
On the contrary, having opinions, you can only form opinions if you deliberately and resolutely shut down the information on one or more sides of the argument. Otherwise, you'll never reach a conclusion about anything.
yeah. I mean
Um,
the difficulty I think we've all had is um, you could explore everything as a endless thought experiment, an endless cone of possibility, and gather more information, gather more perspective, become more wise before you uh, uh, draw a conclusion. But we're also living practically in the world, and
sure.
there's also many things where it's a sense of urgency, and so it's a very it's fascinating to think about, but it's also difficult to implement. But on that note, I mean, you're someone who I know for years. Full disclosure, I've admired you for years. It's not a new thing that you're on that I'm admiring you in this episode, and you've always been uh, observing and gathering information about this troubled world.
Hmm.
So let's get back to the
Well,
matter.
and it's not that I have no opinions. I have few opinions, and actually having few opinions is a good place to start writing a book. Because if you have too many, then I think it's probably indigestible. The other thing is there are far too many non-fiction books in the world, um, particularly ones like mine that basically moan about the state of the world. And I think before you take the fateful decision to contribute yet another book to that pile that could reach to Saturn and back 5 times over, you have to have a proper sense of responsibility about your contribution to the information overload. And you have to ask yourself, does the world really need another book? And does this one deserve to occupy that tenuous space?
Well, this is an extraordinarily well-reviewed book, and your work is having enormous influence. So tell us about. One of the things that struck me about the book was that it a travel log or an adventure story or a book on geopolitics. Was it a prescriptive book? Was it a draw your own conclusions book? Um, the good country equation. I mean, that's pretty ambitious.
Yeah, I mean, um, it's an attempt to describe what's wrong with the world from my particular perspective, um, and some concrete suggestions on how we can set about fixing it. But it's written in the form of a tragico-comical travelogue. So there's a good deal of humor, a good deal of literary description, by which I don't mean boring literary, I mean colorful literary, um, and a certain amount of farce. Because one of the funny things, I'm lucky enough to do this unusual job of swanning around the globe advising leaders. And there's something about that job that means it's always accompanied by a certain level of farce. weird things always happen. They're absurd, and they usually end up with a complete loss of dignity on my part. And every time I came back over the last 20 years from a trip to somewhere or other and told funny stories about the embarrassing things that had happened to me, people were always saying, "You've got to write a book about this." And I said, "Shut up and leave me alone. I've got work to do." And then somehow or other, I suddenly thought, maybe they're right. Maybe I do need to write a book about what I think is wrong with the world and how we can fix it, because I desperately wanted to have a public discussion about that. I wanted to have that conversation with as many people as possible, as publicly as possible. But you know what? I'll write it in the form of a travelogue, so at least it'll be unputdownable. So I borrowed something from fiction there. The fact that fiction is written in color and textbooks, which I can't read, and most of us can't read, are written in black and white. So there are descriptions of people and places and episodes, some of them comical, which are literally designed to make you want to read the whole thing from cover to cover. And I have had a few people say that they read it in one sitting and then started reading it again, which is really nice, as long as they're not just lying.
Very nice. What's wrong with the world, Simon? Tell us.
Well, there are two things wrong with the world. One is the way that countries behave, and the other is the way that people behave. So the way that countries behave is that their underlying DNA is a culture of competition. Ever since the Treaty of Westphalia, and in fact long before, countries have been programmed to compete against each other. In the old days, it used to be bloody conflict. These days, it's more commercial competition. But basically, it's all about countries trying to gain ascendancy over each other. And the problem with that is that it means there's not nearly enough cooperation and collaboration. And cooperation and collaboration is what we need if we're going to defeat any of the grand challenges that we're facing at the moment: pandemics, climate change, human rights abuses, you name it. Those are all thoroughly globalized problems. So humanity at this point in its history has been vastly more successful at globalizing its problems than globalizing the solutions. And that's at least partly because we simply don't work together consistently, diligently, imaginatively, courageously enough to make headway against the challenges. We collaborate when we absolutely have to, and then we do it unwillingly, grudgingly, sporadically, and ineffectually. So the first thing that's wrong with the world is the culture of governance. We need to change that culture from fundamentally competitive to fundamentally collaborative before we can move forward. The other thing that's wrong with the world is the way that people behave. We persist in behaving in ways which A, allow countries to behave in the wrong way. We get the leaders we deserve and the government we deserve. And B, the other problem with the way people behave is that our behaviors perpetuate the global challenges. We keep on living lifestyles that cause higher CO2 emissions and therefore cause climate change. We persist in consuming irresponsibly. We persist in fighting each other when we should be getting on with each other, and so forth. So what the book says is that that's the equation. Those two things are wrong with the world, and here are two directions for fixing them. So the way that we start fixing the way countries behave is by winkling out the self-interested behaviors that countries can pursue, which enable them to benefit from collaboration even more than they benefit from competition. And then on the people's side, that's a question of education. The reason we behave the way we behave is because of the way that we've been brought up or failed to have been brought up. So I propose a global compact on a set of values, virtues, and skill sets, which everybody in the world can agree on. We'll teach all of our children in the next generation those values, virtues, and skill sets, and then we'll finally have a human race that runs towards the grand challenges instead of running away from them.
So we've all listened to world leaders, and not necessarily world leaders. There's world leaders are the heads of states, the heads of regional organizations and international organizations, but there's that next tier and the tier below them that run everything. And we've all been to the meetings with all three of those kinds of groups where the language of cooperation is so continually expressed that it's almost obligatory with the job. Um, Everyone knows this, what you have said. Everyone knows that we have to do these things. What is in the way? There must be something, just the culture of governance. Um, doesn't, either it's so strong that, like much of human life, we're so embedded in it that we don't notice that it could be any other way, or there's particular things about it that get in the way. Is it both? Is it none of that? What do you
It's
think?
both. It's both, and some other things. So the culture of governance is very, very deeply rooted. It's a funny thing that I've observed. I mean, I'm lucky enough to have worked with the heads of state and heads of government of getting on for 60 countries. And amongst those 60 leaders, you've had people from widely divergent backgrounds. So this is nothing to do with their particular political ideology. This is nothing to do with whether they're left wing or right wing or whatever. Something or other determines that when you reach the level where you're running a country, where you're the ultimate decision maker, you automatically, perhaps without even realizing it, subscribe to a single ideology of international governance. Um, and that has characteristics which are very detrimental to human progress. One of them is this absolutely unquestioned assumption that domestic and international are antagonistic to each other. Um, the assumption that I've found amongst highly intelligent, very well-meaning, very well-traveled leaders that, look, anything that we do that's going to stave off climate change is going to be bad for our economic growth. If we cut emissions, we will lose growth, things like that. Or anything I do that's good for my own people, I know somebody's going to tell me afterwards that it's bad for somebody else, and I don't even want to think about it. Because in the end, what's good for my own people is what I need to do if I want to stay in power and get re-elected. So they frame the situation as if there were two baskets here. One is called foreign, one is called domestic, and they are mutually incompatible. And luckily, doing the job that I do, I've been able to experiment over the years with real policies in real policy environments and actually try things out on a national and international scale. And what I've discovered is that if you only dare to start trying, um, a miraculous thing happens. Not only can you very often create domestic policies that benefit people outside your own borders, but you will actually end up producing better policy as a result. So this is not about compromise. Obviously, not every single policy area can be treated in this way. There are some policy areas which are zero-sum games. I mean, nuclear proliferation, for example, almost by definition, what you do in defending your own country is going to be inimical to the defense of other countries. But that still leaves, even if you exclude the ones that are intransigently zero-sum, that still leaves you with a good, I don't know, 70% of policy areas where the more you merge your domestic challenges with the international situation, the more you collaborate, cooperate, share best practice, co-create with other countries, the more flexible and internationally minded, the longer, the wider the perspective you take on any policy issue, the better your policy making becomes. So one of the things that I'm forever having to reassure governments is that this is not one of those sermons that basically says, wouldn't it be lovely if everybody was lovely? I didn't want to write a book that says that because too many of them do. This is not about national self-sacrifice. I was never scandalized by Donald Trump saying America first. I was singularly unimpressed by it. It's a statement of the bleeding obvious. Of course, if you're elected to run a country, you put the interests of that country first. It's your goddamn job. But what was depressing about Trump's view on that was the assumption that everybody else has to come last in order for America to come first. And the tragedy of Trump was that America, of all countries, is the one that perhaps has done most over the centuries to prove that you can come first and you can also help others to aspire to come first. And the rising tide lifts all ships. We knew this from industry back in the 1970s with co-opetition. You can mingle cooperation and collaboration, and what comes out at the end is something rather productive and rather new and rather special and rather fruitful. So to answer your question, there are a lot of very deeply rooted expectations that this is a blind alley. And the only reason why most governments think it's a blind alley is because they've never gone exploring there. And what I've been able to do in my career, and this is what I show in the book, is you start walking down that blind alley with them with a big torch and say, let's just try this and see what that looks like. And suddenly you begin to realize there's a whole world of policy making out there, which most policymakers have never even dreamed of. I wouldn't dream of asking nations to become self-sacrificing. That would be absurd. Nations are not designed for self-sacrifice, and neither are their leaders. This is about enlightened self-interest. This is not about morality. This is about what works. And I think that's very, very important. And the other thing, and I'll shut up after I've said this, the other thing it's very important to understand is it's not about rich countries helping poor countries. There is a place for that. Actually, the place for it was in the 19th century, but we understand that economic development is still required, and giving money to those that don't have it is still a useful thing to do occasionally. But the problem is that societies like the American and the European societies, which worship money, have a fatal habit of interpreting everything that's wrong with the world in monetary terms. And there is this underlying assumption to virtually every NGO out there, whether it's talking about education or whether it's talking about poverty itself or climate change or pandemics or whatever, that it's all about money. And if only the countries above the equator that have too many dollars could transfer some of those spare dollars to the countries below the equator that don't have enough dollars, then all the problems of the world would be solved. It's the white man's burden. It's odious and it's illogical and it doesn't work. All countries on earth, irrespective of their past, irrespective of their power, have an equal responsibility for the planet that they inhabit.
So one of the reasons why the good country equation was able to be formulated and turned into a book and shared with many people and have such a great reception is that it grew out of the Good Country Index, which you developed in 2014.
Mm.
Even creating something called Good Country, um, it prompts either a skepticism or an air of challenge, or for sure a fascination, which is, what the heck is that about? A good country? Are there any? What defines one? What prompted you to do that, and why has this been adopted by so many people and places?
Let me answer those in slightly juggled around order. Are there any good countries? No. Okay, so my definition of a good country is a country that successfully harmonizes its domestic and international responsibilities. That, I think, is the gold standard of good governance for the 21st century. If we can get all or most countries to learn how to do that and to experience the benefits of it, then we're on our way to making life on Earth sustainable.
So your definition of good is that a country understands that its national self-interest is not only not in conflict with humanity's interests, but if it's harmonized with them, then it is the equivalent of a good member of a team.
Exactly.
A bad member of a team with one who doesn't play with the team and
Exactly.
doesn't look after the team's interest, even though that player might also be racking up their own goals.
And in fact, I often use the metaphor of the team that, the America First or Hungary First or Philippines First doctrine is the equivalent of believing that life on Earth is a sprint to the finish, where there's one winner and a bunch of losers. And of course, it's not. It's a team sport. So absolutely, that's a good metaphor. So to return to your question, yes, it is fundamentally about being able to harmonize your domestic and your international responsibilities. And on that basis, there are no good countries, in the sense that there are no countries that fully do that. And I often say that in the Good Country Index, it's a ranking. It goes from 1 to 156 or whatever it is. If I were being really honest about this, no, I am being honest. If I were being really heartless about this, I'd probably leave the first 40 places blank and start with Sweden, as it currently is, at the top of the index at 41, because I don't wish to imply that the countries that are at number 1, number 2, number 3, etc., are doing fine and they don't need to try any harder. They're just doing a lot better than everybody else. So
before you go on, I want to go back to one point. You said earlier that a leader is expected to put their country's interests above others. And yet a good country would be one that harmonizes, in other words, doesn't do that only, but
Mm.
does it in a way that by definition doesn't put its interests first, but sees them as not in conflict, the globe's interest versus their nation's interest. So is there something fundamentally um, incompatible with uh, full global interdependence and the current structure of national governance?
Mm.
Or is there something, like most things in life, it's a complex, ever complex interrelationship between the two, and perfection would be an extreme.
Yes, I think that I think it's the last thing you said. I think that's what I agree with. You see, there is only a conflict here if you phrase it the way that you phrased it. Because when you said you accept that a leader's responsibility is to put their country ahead of everybody else's, that's not the way I would phrase it. I would say the responsibility of a leader is to do the best they can for their people and their slice of territory. Now that's not the same thing as saying ahead of, because as soon as you start saying ahead of, it implies that the standard by which you measure the quality of your performance as a leader is how much better you are doing than other countries. And it's this competitive framing of things that I think gets in the way. There is absolutely no need to be ahead of anybody else, to be doing better than anybody else, as long as you're doing well enough. And this is all tied up, of course, with the fixation on continuous growth that's part of the baggage of economics that we've inherited since the early 20th century. And that's a whole other conversation. But I think that if leaders focus on paying, on doing their duty as leaders, in other words, providing the stability, prosperity, peace, justice, dignity that it is their responsibility to give to their own people, if they can then do that, or do an even better job of doing that by also not harming and preferably benefiting the people and places of other countries, then they're doing even better. So I don't see a contradiction there. In fact, quite the contrary. Um, I see enormous scope for better government. And you see it time and time again. I mean, if we had time, I'd give you examples, but each example takes so long to tell. That's why I felt I had to write a book about it, because the examples do take, a few pages to explain. But there are plenty of examples in the book that show that this really is a win-win. It's not a question of self-sacrifice.
So
But there was another part of Jim, sorry, there was another part of your question that I did want to answer. It's
yeah.
a slightly less fundamental one, but you also asked about the term good and how the responses that tends to elicit. And it is an interesting point, because of course good, the term good in the English language and its equivalents in most other languages, is associated with morality or ethics. And actually what I'm really talking about here has got relatively little to do with morality or ethics. So why on earth did I choose that word? It's so simple, it's so childish, it's so, in many senses, offensive here. The reason is because one of the things I've learned over the years is that if you want to capture people's attention, you either have to be rich or provocative. And because I'm not rich, I thought I'd better be provocative. So the cost of developing an entirely new language to describe your thoughts, which you believe are original, and then getting that language adopted, absorbed, listened to, learned, and used by possibly millions of other people, the cost of that is staggering. It takes time, it takes money, and it takes power, which I don't have. So much, rather than trying to coin a new term, which is a nuisance, and you'll end up with some horrible jargon, much better to take a simple word that everybody knows and accept the fact that you're going to be sharing footprint with a lot of other concepts. You're going to be living on a plot of land that belongs to plenty of other people. You're going to have to share it with lots of religions. You're going to have to share it with lots of other people. But just say to people, okay, I want you to understand that I'm using this term in a particular way. And you're allowed to do that with language. I don't mean good the opposite of bad. I mean good the opposite of selfish. Bear with me. That's what I'm talking about. And on the whole, I find that people have accepted that just fine. And the most important thing about using such childishly simple language is that people are prepared to use it themselves. After spending half an hour ranting at me for my loose use of language, they then go off and say, yeah, now, so are we a good country? and they use it themselves. So it's a good formula. I'm pleased with it.
Um, Before I get to the question, I was going to ask, for those who don't know, describe very specifically, and I give you permission to toot your own horn. Who's using? How popular is the Good Country Index? Who's using it? What are the ripple effects?
Um, Well, it's good of you to ask. When first of all, the idea really caught on quite quickly in a way that I wasn't really expecting. I launched the first edition of the Good Country Index at a TED event in 2014, and to everybody's surprise, including my own, the talk went viral. Um, and it's now, if you count up the views on TED.com and the views on YouTube alone, it's now had over 12 million views, which is a good number for a talk on international relations. Most of them don't get past 100,000 or so. It is in the category of government, it is the highest, it has the highest number of views of any TED talk in all time. Um, and it's also the rated #4 most, quote, inspiring by TED viewers. So again, for a talk which is about an index, that's what it's really all about. It's announcing this country ranking. All of that is quite surprising and suggests that it struck a chord with a particular audience who were looking for something of that sort. And subsequently, we may have time to talk about this. I've done quite a lot of research into who that audience is and why it resonated so powerfully with them. It's now in its 5th edition and has every time I release it, which is every year, it gets 400 to 500 million eyeballs via the conventional media and the social media around the world. It is cited by the US Department of State in their public diplomacy report as one of the indicators of soft power, if you want to call it that. And it was one of only 3 external data sources cited by the United Nations in their 75th anniversary report this year. So those are just 2 examples of which I'm particularly proud, but they show that this funny idea of measuring a country by its external impact rather than its internal performance, which is an entirely new idea, is beginning to gain some traction and people are getting it. I also get, very amusingly, at least once a year, I get a country ringing me up and asking how much it would cost to put them 5 places higher in the index. And I always say, I'm really sorry, but I couldn't do that if I tried, because
Well,
the
what you should say is anyone who makes those calls gets moved down 5 points in the ranking.
well, I'm tempted. But actually, it's impossible for me to rig the results because it's so simple. There's no weird arithmetic going on there. There are no
So,
weird algorithms.
yeah. So before we talk about what you mentioned just a moment ago about sort of the kinds of people that find this appealing,
Mm,
um, uh, which we've all met those people. You and I are those people.
mm,
I want to ask about the following. It used to be before this century, and probably uh, maybe before the second half of the 20th century,
mm,
that in all of human history, that most people, and probably even in many cases most leaders, didn't know that much about what was going on in other countries. They might have known the highlights,
mm,
or the strengths or weaknesses, particularly if they had helped that country or hindered that country repeatedly.
mm,
But the idea that they knew kind of the model of that country's the details of the culture and the political culture and the governance structure and the civic engagement mindset, so to speak, of what was going on in the country was highly unlikely.
mm,
So, but now people are able to observe, admittedly through the distorting lens of media and bias and so forth, but still much more able to observe other countries' successes and failures
mm,
in real time
mm,
at a great amount of detail. So, given now that every country is a visible model for every other country to embrace or avoid,
mm.
how does that impact your thinking about um, other ways in the way that I just described, for example, that good countries can influence other countries as they desire to imitate them?
Um, there's no question that that being a good country um, imparts authority. It turns countries into leaders that are followed. Otherwise, why are the Nordics, for example, always at the top of the good country index? Why are they so widely copied and admired by other countries? It all ties in with this fascinating topic of country image, which, as you know, is a subject I've worked with and studied for many years and also measured. And the reason why I actually made the Good Country Index in the first place was as a result of measuring the images of countries for years and years and years, and feeling very curious about what actually gives a country a good reputation, because a good reputation means leadership. The countries that are internationally admired, the countries that people follow and copy and want to work with and want to do business with, are the ones with the best reputations. And I've been measuring the reputations of countries since 2005. I have an annual study which is called the Anholt Ipsos Nation Brands Index, which is a big international opinion poll. And every year, the research company Ipsos and I poll 25,000 people in 25 countries around the world. And we submit to them a very, very detailed questionnaire about 50 countries, just to measure their perceptions of those countries. And it's deeply fascinating because the countries with the best images are the ones that get most trade, they get most tourism, they get most productive diplomatic and cultural relations. They're the ones that do best. So if you want to do well, you need a good image. This is just like in the corporate sector. The companies with the best brand images, like Nike, are the ones who do the most business. So it begs the question, where does a good image come from? And what I'd learned over the years was that it was really nothing to do with how much effort countries spend on bragging about how wonderful they are. Propaganda doesn't work internationally. I can prove that. It's there in the stats. There's absolutely no correlation between how much money a country spends on bragging about itself and how good its image is. It seems to come from somewhere else completely. So in 2012, I decided that I was going to take some time off and analyze the database that I'd accumulated thus far in the Nation Brands Index, which was nearly 1 billion data points. So I thought if the answer is not in there, it's nowhere to be found just yet. And it was there to be found. What I did was I simply asked this huge database, what is the primary driver of a positive national reputation? And it turns out, although there are many components in there, that by far the most powerful driver of a good national image is the perception that you as a country contribute to the world outside your own borders, that you're a good neighbor to other countries, that people feel glad that you exist. And that was what triggered me to do the Good Country Index, which is a measurement of reality, because I thought, how is it that people actually know which countries are good? Countries are good and bad. They do a bunch of mixed stuff all the time. But net net, you can do this balance sheet and figure it out. So one of the rewards for being a good country is that it improves your image. And if your image is improved, then everything becomes easy. To use the language of economics, if you're a country with a weak or a negative issue, you have a structural deficit. Everything you do is harder and more expensive because you're constantly battling against the headwind of people's negative perceptions and negative expectations. If you're lucky enough to be Switzerland or Canada, universally admired, everything is easy and everything is cheap. So one of the central paradoxes of the good country equation is simply this, that if you want to do, if you want to do well, you have to do good. It's exactly the same message as corporate social responsibility, except at the level of the nation state. So I guess that was kind of my big discovery, and it's one of the main reasons why I think that we stand a chance of persuading selfish national governments to do the right thing, because via this dynamic, I can demonstrate statistically that it's in their own interest to do so.
Thank you. So we just talked about how, from the governmental perspective, uh, self-interest and interests and values.
Mm.
What about the individuals? What kind of individuals care at all about these sorts of topics? And also, you have a situation where in this globalized world, and the world I was just talking about, where people are in real time observing
Mm.
the other models
Yeah.
and the behavior of other countries, um, particularly those kind of people that are most interested in these issues also are very aware that they have no say in what happens in the direction of those other countries that are affecting them, or that their government, were it higher up on the rankings, would be more interacting with and cooperating with. So I know you did something called the global vote, but before or as you describe the global vote, first, is there a certain type of person that kind of gets it when we're talking about this topic that we're talking about?
I think almost everybody gets it when you talk about it. But it is, having said that, it's not a common topic for discussion amongst the vast majority of people. Um, Most people, in this limited sense of the word, are localists, in the sense that they are quite understandably more interested in their immediate environment than anything else, because that's what has, as far as one can see, the greatest impact on oneself. So the question is really, how willing are people, and under what circumstances, to allow their thoughts to move upwards on the scale, to the extent that they stop thinking perhaps about their own village or town, but about their region, about their whole nation, about their supranational region, and about the planet. And that is something that most people, including myself, find quite uncomfortable and quite hard work. I mean, because of the work that I do, because of the things I'm interested in, I spend quite a lot of my day trying to think about things at the global level. And the brain hurts, doesn't it? I mean, you're the same. It stretches your brain. And that's quite pleasant for a bit, but it's tiring and it's not a happy place to sit. For the vast majority of humanity, I think the sense of belonging, the sense of where you sit, the perspective you have on the real world within which you occupy a space, has never extended past the nation state. You can look at this in if you like, metaphorically, rather in the same way as you look at an individual human. When a baby is born, it it is fundamentally self-interested for the first few moments of its life. It's really just focused on survival. Very, very quickly, it transfers some of that sense of loyalty and oneness to its mother or to whoever is nursing it. And then, if he's lucky, to the father, and then gradually, as the child grows, to the wider family, to the village, and so forth. And then gradually during one's life, it gets as far as the nation state, and there it stops. And this is one of the challenges that we're facing, that we have to somehow find ways of letting people understand what it means to feel loyalty to the whole human race, because otherwise we're going to be stuck forever in this zone of competition between nation states. And of course, there is benign nationalism. Of course, patriotism, loving your own country, is not intrinsically a bad thing, but there needs to be something beyond that, a sense of belonging. And the problem is that we don't have a common enemy, unless we're sitting in the cinema watching Independence Day and we're looking at scary aliens. Actually, the time you will get real global citizens is if you stand at the exit doors of a cinema in the afternoon as people come out after watching something like Independence Day, because they are stimulated to think in terms of a common enemy, and they're rooting for the humans when they're in the cinema watching that film. And most of the time we don't have it. The pandemic has been useful in this respect because it's shown us what a common enemy looks like, and in doing, well, it's invisible, but we've even more frightening for that reason.
I mean,
And
short of engineering an early visit by aliens,
mm,
could it seems to me that the common enemy, and this has been referred to by great leaders in the past,
mm,
are things like ignorance
mm,
or small-mindedness or
sure,
or orthodoxy, or
sure,
in
but
other words,
they're just
especially
metaphors.
coming out of the pandemic, the idea that we can say, yes, we all sort of generally agree that we're all human and we're all part of one
Mm,
species and we all live on one planet, and there is such a thing as humanity, and ideas like the UN make sense and so on.
mm,
We can all sort of agree generally about stuff like that, um, while having this bias towards national interest.
yeah,
But ignorance could kill you. Ignorance could make your life much more difficult. Ignorance could lead to greater conflict that could hurt you and your family. Ignorance seems like a good candidate for, rather than aliens, for and an immediately available one
Yes.
to reframe our perspective on what we have to do together, which is
Yes.
combat that.
Even though ignorance threatens our survival just exactly as if it were the Yeti running towards us, nonetheless, it doesn't have um, the primal characteristics of an enemy that humanity is capable of recognizing. It's a notion, and we don't respond powerfully to notions. We're not fundamentally an intellectual species. Um, and this is why I think the coronavirus is, if it doesn't sound too cynical, an interesting new player in the game, because it is truly a biological enemy. It's, as I said, invisible to the naked eye, which is, in a sense, unfortunate, in many senses, unfortunate. But it's much, much closer to being perceivable as a common enemy than, for example, ignorance would be, and therefore more useful and more powerful. The simple fact that every single day for the last year, everybody on the planet who has access to news media has been looking at the news media every day and seeing us suffering and fearing and responding as a single species. And that's been incredibly valuable and an incredible generator of solidarity. It's done us a power of good. It's also reminded us that we have no special dispensation to survive, which is important. It's given us a dose of humility, because we have a tendency to think that we're indispensable and immortal. And the vision of this infinitely small beastie that could just wipe us out has been very salutary. It's taught us some humility. So we humanity are getting a lot of lessons in humility at the moment, which I think are very valuable,
And commonality,
and commonality.
which I think
And
is a great combination.
it is a great combination, and it's setting us up nicely now, I think, to start to think much more productively about, for example, climate change than we did BC, before
Um, so
coronavirus.
I want to cover a few more topics before we end our time together. I had asked earlier about the global vote. So could you
Mm,
describe a little bit about the global vote? And I know you're
sure.
also involved in this new initiative, this Good Leader Index.
Yeah. The global vote is on pause at the moment, just because I don't have enough bandwidth. I do all of this stuff on my own, more fool me. But I have lots of wonderful volunteers to help me with these things. The global vote is a platform which enables anybody anywhere in the world to vote on the elections of other people's countries. And it's purely symbolic. You can't actually, of course, sway the result in another country. But the mere fact of reading up on the candidates in a distant country that perhaps you've never even heard about before, and they're scrupulously researched, unbiased, objective, factual profiles, and then going through the process of picking the candidate who you think is going to be the best friend to the international community, not the candidate who's going to do the best for his or her own people, because that's the choice of the domestic population, the ones who are really voting, but the choice of the global vote population around the world is simply to vote for the leader they think
Mhm.
will do the best job of creating a good country. And lots of people, hundreds of thousands, have participated in the various votes that we've held. There's always a lot of enthusiasm when we cover a US presidential election. People enjoy it, and it's a bit of fun, and it's symbolic, but symbols can be quite powerful. And I think what it celebrates is the interconnectedness and interdependence of countries. The point I wish to prove to people is that by covering the election of, for example, Sao Tome and Principe, one of the smallest countries whose elections we've ever covered, we're making a very, very important point to the leaders of that country, to the leaders who hope to be elected, which is, no matter how small the country you're leading, no matter how hidden it is from the mainstream of the international community, nonetheless, if you're elected the president of any country or the prime minister, you join the team that runs the planet, whether you like it or not. And that's important, because even a very small country, a very poor country, a very troubled country can produce the next Nelson Mandela who can make a difference in the world. If they do, if they become a good country and they accept refugees, they can lighten the burden on other countries. Or if they lower their emissions, they could lighten the burden on the planet. If they become an ungood country, a selfish country, and they cause problems, others will have to step in. If they pollute the ocean, that water will end up on somebody else's shores. If they
So these
pollute
are all
the
the
air,
decisions of leaders. What
these are
is
all the
the
decisions
good
we use.
leader index then?
So the good leader index is as distinct from the good country index. This is not measured. The good country index is based on data. Most of it comes from the United Nations system. It uses 35 different data sets that actually measure the measurable impact of countries outside their borders. The good leader index is unashamedly an op-ed. It's my own personal opinion on which leaders month by month are doing the best to be good leaders and which are doing the worst. And again, I'm ably supported by a group of mainly international relations students and graduates from all over the world who help to look for the candidates and research them and help me reach these
It would
decisions.
be interesting to have the global vote community not vote only on the other countries, but to vote on the good leader candidates, to
Yes,
rank them.
um,
I, there's something very appealing about the circularity to that.
yes, I agree with you, and it is something that we've discussed. The difficulty is, just how much stuff can you do from your own bedroom?
Mm.
Um, because for me, publishing the Good Country Index, which is a
The answer to
gigantic
that
task.
question is the question of this last year of the pandemic. How much stuff
Right.
can you do from your bedroom?
Well, certainly in
And
terms of,
you've proven a lot, and you can change the world. So
yes, I mean, the question wasn't so much about the bedroom. The question was more about the you, if you're just one individual, um, without a research team,
I realize, yeah.
without funding, without any of that stuff. I think if nothing else, may it be written on my tombstone that I explored the possibility of the individual global social entrepreneur, to demonstrate to anybody who says, I can't make a difference on my own about all the things that worry me. I hope to be in the process of proving that you can try really quite hard. And if you stick with it, and you don't mind the challenges um, and the the poverty, you can get quite a long way. We no longer, thank heavens, live in an age where only the United Nations can publish an index and have it taken seriously. I'm one guy in my bedroom and the index is now taken seriously. Um, and that's really, really reassuring because it suggests there is a future for social entrepreneurship at the global level.
Again, on the topic of individuals, and I mentioned this earlier, what I, you've done a great job of gathering information, assessing information, or that you've gathered or that others have gathered,
Mm,
looking for patterns, threads,
mm.
um, uh, opportunities of leverage, etc. Um, is there a cohort of the world's population that is more receptive to what you've said? You explained earlier that most people don't think about these things, and you even explained for yourself the amount of extra effort, the reframing. That's probably an evolutionary psychological thing that
Mm.
we weren't made to think about what was going on 1,000 miles away. As we were evolving, we had to survive based on what was around us. But you and I are both people like this, and I think we know a lot of people, and we've encountered many strangers that seem to have almost a natural affinity to seeing themselves as humans rather than of their nation only. Um, Tell me a little bit more about that, and has that been useful to you?
Yeah, I think I first started realizing that there's a character type of which you and I think, are examples that just quite naturally thinks of itself as human first and a citizen of their own nation at least first equal, but possibly even further down the list. Um, Many of the people I know who are like this, like me when we were growing up, just felt instinctively that other countries were always going to be more interesting than our own country. And the people who live in other countries were always going to be more interesting than the people who lived in our own country. And never saw diversity as a threat, but as a source of constant fascination. Um, and I first started hearing from these um, fellow thinkers when the Good Country Index went up and the TED Talk with it. And that introduced my work to a much, much larger group of people, for the first time, millions. And I started getting loads and loads of people reaching out to me and describing themselves in terms like this, which I found very, very familiar. So to cut a long story short, after I'd received about 20,000 emails from people who'd seen my TED Talk and described themselves and explained that that was why they were interested in what I was saying, um, I did some further research with my colleague Robert Govers, and we identified a personality type, which we called natural cosmopolitans. And these are people who are just born being interested in the world and born believing that they're citizens of the world before they are citizens of their own nation. And interestingly, that character type doesn't correlate with gender. It's equal numbers of men and women. It doesn't correlate with income. It's not rich people who think that way. It doesn't correlate with education. It's not necessarily people who've had secondary or tertiary education who think that way. It just seems to be a cast of mind. The only way that you can predict it is that there are more of these people in some countries than in others. So it's not surprising to learn that there's a very high percentage of people with that mindset in Sweden, for example, because the Swedish culture tends to awaken people to that. So it suggests that the proportion, it's about 10% of the world's population, about 700 million people, which is a large number. It would be the third largest country on earth if it were a country after China and India. Um, Having said that, the rather boring fact that Sweden is near the top of the list, there are some other countries that have got almost equal numbers of natural cosmopolitans in their population that are less expected. Trinidad and Tobago and Burkina Faso are both countries that are in the top 20 in terms of the distribution of natural cosmopolitans in their population. So there are people like this everywhere. And I think beyond the 10%, there's probably at least another 30, 40% of humanity who would not disagree with a word of anything that we've said. Well, they might disagree with what we've said, but they wouldn't disagree with the idea that we are all members of the same species, that we need to hang together, that there's nothing wrong with difference. In fact, there's a lot that's right with difference, and so on and so on and so on. But maybe they just don't think about it spontaneously quite so many hours in the day as you and I do.
Is this an instinct, quote unquote instinct of some humans, again with an evolutionary uh, value, or is it something that's taught in school, or is it just something that has developed in some weird alchemy within particular cultures?
Interesting questions. I very much like the idea that it might be the early signs of an evolutionary tendency. Um, because if you think about it, we, ever since we left the Great Rift Valley tens of thousands of years ago and stopped being a single tribe facing a common set of challenges and spread ourselves out all over the surface of the planet, the history of human progress since that day has been a story of us trying to get back together again and being a single tribe. And the interesting thing about right now is that we've very nearly got there. With our technologies of communication and transport, saving the pandemic for a moment, we are capable of being virtually a single tribe all over again,
If you
facing.
think about our survival, we this is not an intellectual leap of anthropology, but if one of the first things that we do when we encounter another being, particularly another human, is friend or foe.
Mm,
Is this dangerous or not? Are we in the same tribe?
mm,
And uh, if in most of human history, we very rarely encountered someone who was not of our tribe
mm,
or our culture. And uh,
And if we did, they were dangerous.
Or we had to start assume that they might be.
Hmm.
And but again, as I was saying earlier, due to the exposure that we all have, the constant exposure to other cultures,
Hmm.
peoples, locations on the planet,
Hmm.
we're finding ourselves not necessarily saying that's a friend just because I'm aware of them, but constantly being forced to ask the question, friend or foe, friend or foe, friend or foe. And it's the asking of that question that surfaces the type of inquiry
Hmm.
that makes you filter all your experiences,
Hmm.
um, to try to get to a better answer to that question, because it's your instinct to answer that question all the
Yeah.
time. And if you are asking the question, then that creates ripe conditions for people to talk about the things that you and I are talking about right now,
Yes.
in ways that the average person would never have done in the past.
I think it's a really good hypothesis. And I've got one interesting set of data, actually the biggest set of data of all, that seems to confirm this. I mentioned the Nation Brands Index, which measures the images of countries. And I discovered a really interesting thing with that index. If you take the overall strength of the image of every country that I've ever measured in the Nation Brands Index, and you plot it on a simple line chart every year that I've been measuring it from 2005 to today, you'll see a whole load of colored lines moving across the page. And those are the overall images of 50 odd countries. And the first thing that you notice when you look at that is that they move as a cohort. They don't move separately. So the way that countries are perceived by the world's population has got more to do with the world's mood than it has to do with anything to do with how those countries behave. But the more interesting thing is that they all move upwards. Over time, every single country has a better image on average than it did the previous year.
Well, and
And
but the first one, I don't necessarily think is. I think they're both equally interesting, because it's the movement together which supports my assertion that everyone's now so aware of the mood that it
yes,
becomes a
right,
global mood.
exactly. But they are both important in their own way, but for the purposes of this particular point, I think the second one is more interesting, because basically what that's telling us is that on average, everybody on the planet thinks better of every other country with every year that passes. And it seems to me that the only possible hypothesis for an explanation for that is the effect of globalization. With every year that passes, as you yourself said earlier, we are confronted with more and more data about other people living in other countries and leading other lives. The consequence of that is that with every year that passes, we're more and more used to the idea
Yeah.
that we share the planet with other species. And it's well
They are
noted
less
in a lot of
strange.
social surveys.
They're
I'm sorry?
others. The other is less strange to us with
Mm.
each passing year.
Exactly, exactly. And in fact, I was going to say it's well noted in the social sciences that what's the opposite of familiarity breeds contempt? Familiarity breeds positivity. The more you become accustomed to something, the more you like it, and the more you trust it. And that's evolutionary again, because if there's a creature sitting in the corner of your cave, every day that it doesn't kill you, you trust it and like it more,
Mhm.
because it hasn't killed you. And we trust things that have been around for a while. And so that the general drive of globalization, for all its faults and all its failings and all its mismanagement, is a positive one, which is one of the reasons why I'm super optimistic about the state of the world at the moment, because it's just an absolutely unstoppable process that with every year that passes, en masse, we human beings are more and more and more well disposed towards each other and better able to cope with an interconnected world.
So you're working on this Good Generation project now. Before we wrap
Mm.
up, I just want to make sure that you can tell people about that project, because it seems
Sure,
directly related to what we just discussed.
absolutely. Thank you for that. Well, as I said right at the beginning, there are two things wrong with the world. One is the way that countries behave, and the other is the way that people behave. And as I said, the way that people behave is predicated on the way that they're brought up. And I guess another way of explaining the thinking behind the Good Generation project is in the context of the pandemic. We have a vaccine now for the pandemic. So where's the vaccine for climate change? Where's the vaccine for migration? Where's the vaccine for poverty and inequality? Where's the vaccine for conflict and terrorism and injustice and human rights abuses and modern day slavery and narco trafficking and all the rest of it? Well, we also have the vaccine for all of those, and it's called education. If you bring people up in the right way with the right values, then they don't cause and perpetrate and sustain those problems. The problem with that vaccine is the same as the problem with the COVID vaccine, that it's not adequately distributed. Distribution is the challenge. Education is unequally distributed, education of the right sort, personal development as well as learning facts. And so you see it popping up, and wherever it pops up, it demonstrably works. So, for example, in Swedish schools where they teach about climate change, you, it produces Greta Thunberg, who is a more effective advocate for climate change than before she's even left school than you or I would be in the whole of our lives. Up pops Malala as a more effective advocate for the education of girls than you or I could ever be. And that's because the life experience and the education and the development of those children has been done in the right way. So we know it works. It's been known for 100 years that if you teach people the right things at school and they go on to behave in the right way, that produces a society that works in the right ways. So the good generation is basically a proposition that we as a species should try and collaborate on the production of a new compact of global virtues, values, and skill sets. What I'm going to be doing is convening a big online global conversation involving literally every country on earth, 203, I think, at the last count, of children, parents, teachers, experts, and others in every single one of those countries to debate what are the values and virtues and skill sets that we all agree, notwithstanding our cultural and religious differences, we would like our children to absorb during their early years, so that then when they're ready to leave school, they can run towards the grand challenges instead of running away from them, which is what our generation has mostly done. Um, and anybody who says you'll never manage it, it's impossible. The education of children is too sensitive. Cultures are too different. There's too much misunderstanding. I would just say to people, go have another look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. One of the finest achievements of humanity, a beautiful, beautiful document, brings tears to my eyes every time I read it. We did that. And I would argue that human rights is even more sensitive a topic than the education of children. But in 1948 or whenever it was that we did that, it was felt to be a matter of urgency, and humanity managed to get together and do it. The UN Charter in 1946, same deal. So previous experience suggests that when we really urgently need to agree on something, notwithstanding all our famous and much exaggerated cultural differences, we can do it. So the idea is that we'll produce this compact, and then the good generation becomes a foundation that works with educational providers all around the world to inject, if that's not too frightening a word, that basic set of values, virtues, and skill sets into as much educational material, reaching as many children as possible in time for the next generation.
As you know, my own career has been a series of social entrepreneurial initiatives with a sense of deep awareness of concern about the problems we have, the challenges we face, uh, including existential ones. And um, my latest organization, that is the host of this series, is called the Global Partnership for Civic Engagement. And
I know. In fact, I think I'm one of its advisors.
you are, and for that we're grateful. But on that note, uh, our motto is rethinking civilization together.
Yeah.
Um, to even want to do that, you have to
Mm.
be at least a bit of an optimist that
Yeah.
it's worth doing.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you as your closing comment, um, given the more work that you do, the more
Mm.
exposure you've had, the more digging you do into the underpinnings and the of civilization, are you more of an optimist or less of an optimist? This good generation project to me, I think, could only be done by a great optimist.
Mm.
So how as your closing remarks, what would you want to say to people about, if you are an optimist, why?
Yeah. I am an optimist. It's an incurable disease, I'm afraid. I've given up trying to figure out how to fix it. It's just my natural cast of mind. And so maybe it's cognitive bias, but all the research I do, almost everything I see, makes me think that net things are heading in the right direction. I think we're on the verge of a really, really exciting period for humanity. Humanity has a distinguished history of changing direction at the last possible moment. And I think we're in the process of doing that. I worry intensely about climate change because of the inertia within the system. 11:59 is when humanity generally changes. And
Yep.
11:59 is about 10 minutes too late for atmospheric CO2. But we'll see. I mean, barring that and a few other anxieties, I see I get so much hope from young people because of the good generation. I'm spending a lot of time talking to kids at the moment and parents and teachers. And the generations that are coming up at the moment, they're they're so brilliant in so many ways. And they just want to learn and they just want to fix things. And it's difficult to spend time with them and not believe that things are going to be so much better by the time they're our age and we've checked out. Um, so I feel super positive at the moment. I think we're beginning to learn some really, really useful and exciting things.
Thank you. Welcome to the Global Partnership for Civic Engagement. Welcome to, uh, and thank you for being the second speaker in the World Scale Ideas series. And uh, and I'm sure all of our listeners and viewers um, cannot wait to see how impactful your work will be. We're very confident that it will be as impactful as your previous work. And we can't wait to see what you come up with next because the world's a better place for having you in it. So, on
Thank
behalf
you, Jane.
of the Global Partnership, thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Jane.